The bread came before the light. That was the first thing. Before the eye could make sense of where it was. Before the darkness had resolved itself into shapes and shadows and the specific geometry of stone, the smell arrived. It moved through the cold air of the cave with the authority of something that did not require permission. Something that had been present in this world long before anyone had thought to question its right to be there. It was the smell of a crust gone golden in dry heat, of a crumb still holding its warmth of wild grain that had been persuaded by time and patience and the invisible life of fermentation to become something it could not have become alone. It was the smell of bread. Real bread. The kind that takes days and attention, and the particular devotion of hands that have learned over decades what the dough needs and when it needs it. And when. And then the eye adjusted. The cave was not large by any measure that a person accustomed to rooms with walls and ceilings would recognize as generous. But it had a quality that rooms rarely had, the quality of something shaped by a longer patience than human patience, by the slow work of water and pressure, and the grinding of geological time. The walls were the color of dark iron streaked here and there, with the rust red of mineral deposits that had been leaching through the stone for longer than anyone in the state of West Virginia had been alive. The floor was uneven, but not impossibly so leveled in sections by deliberate effort by the work of hands that had moved loose stone and packed down the earth beneath, until the surface was something a person could stand on without risk. In one corner, a shelf of flat slate rested on carefully fitted stone supports, and on those shelves, in the amber light of a small oil lamp, stood the loaves. There were perhaps 24 of them, maybe more. They stood in the way of things that have been placed with intention, not stacked carelessly, but arranged with the attention of someone who understood that bread was not merely food, but evidence. Each loaf was dark on the outside in the way of sourdough baked at high heat. The crust cracked in the irregular pattern that comes only from a dough with real life in it. A dough that expands in the oven, not because it has been told to, but because the organisms inside it are still doing what they have always done, still breathing and multiplying and pushing against the thing that contains them. The crumb where one had been broken open and left on the shelf's edge was the color of wheat straw and held the open, irregular structure of a long fermented loaf, the kind of structure that takes at least a day to develop and cannot be hurried without losing something essential. In the center of the cave against the back wall, the oven. It was not a large oven. It did not need to be. It was built into a niche in the rock wall with the precision of something that had been planned on paper before it was touched in stone, the dome of it rising in a smooth curve that showed the hand of someone who had thought about the physics of heat and acted accordingly. The floor of the oven was flat stones fitted together with the tightness of a good floor, and the walls around the dome were thick, 3 or 4 inches of clay pressed over stone, the clay that had been hauled from the creek bed in the ravine below in quantities that represented days of solitary labor. At the crown of the dome, a narrow opening led upward into a passage in the rock that traveled 30 feet through the mountain before emerging at the surface, invisible from below, sheltered from rain by a natural overhang of stone. The smoke went up and disappeared before anyone in the valley below thought to look for it. A woman sat beside the oven. She was not young. She had not been young for a long time, and she carried this fact with the same practical acceptance she brought to every other fact of her life, as information to be noted and accounted for, rather than mourned. She was 62 years old, and she had the hands of a woman who had worked with them for every one of those years, the knuckles enlarged, the skin thickened and mapped with fine lines, the palms showing the particular calluses that develop only from a lifetime of kneading. Her hair, which had been the color of good dark bread in her youth, had gone the color of wood ash, and she wore it pinned back from her face in a manner that was entirely functional, that kept it from falling forward when she leaned over the work. Beside her on the floor of the cave, a dog slept. The dog was old too, a hound mix of indeterminate breeding that had been with Clara Whitmore for 11 years since the autumn Edmund brought it home in his coat pocket and set it on the kitchen floor and laughed at the look on her face. Its muzzle had gone gray in the last few years, and it moved more carefully than it once had. But its sleep was deep and undisturbed, the sleep of an animal that has found the place it belongs to and rests in it completely. The dog's name was Bess. Clara's hand rested on the dog's flank as she sat, not petting, just resting there the way a hand rests on something familiar and warm when the mind is somewhere else entirely. And her mind was somewhere else. It was 4 months back, standing in the doorway of a house she had lived in for 42 years, watching a fire eat something that could not be replaced. Doyle Whitmore was not a complicated man. He had never pretended to be one and would not have recognized the pretense if someone had offered it to him. He was the eldest of the Whitmore brothers, the one who had stayed on the family land when Edmund and the others had scattered, and he had built his understanding of the world on what he could see and count and put a dollar figure to. He was 68 years old when Edmund died, and 68 years old when he came to the house on the 3rd day after the burial, with the legal paperwork in his hand, and the particular expression of a man who has decided that an unpleasant thing must be done, and is going to do it without allowing himself to feel it too deeply. The house belonged to the Whitmore family. This was what Edmund's will said, or more precisely, this was what Doyle said Edmund's will said, and he was the one holding the papers, so he was the one defining their contents. The house passed to the family upon Edmund's death, and the family was represented by Doyle, and Doyle had made his determination about the house and what was going to happen to it. What he had not made a determination about in the days before he came with his papers was the matter of what was on the kitchen shelf. The notebook had been there for as long as Clara had been in the house, which was to say for 42 years. It was a leather-bound thing, not thick, perhaps 60 pages filled with her father's handwriting in the particular dense script of a man who has more to say than he has room to say it. Her father had been the son of a Scottish baker who had come to the Appalachians in 1798 with a sourdough starter in a clay pot, and the conviction that the mountains of West Virginia would reward the patient and punish the arrogant, a conviction that the mountains had confirmed repeatedly throughout his years there. The notebook was his life's technical work, the accumulated knowledge of 30 years of baking in a mountain climate, pages of observation about fermentation, temperatures and oven design and the behavior of different grains under different conditions, diagrams of heat flow through stone, calculations about moisture and crust formation that would not have looked out of place in a university text. Clara's father had given her the notebook on the morning she left for the Whitmore house. He had pressed it into her hands and said that everything he knew was in there, and she had taken it and carried it and kept it on the kitchen shelf for 4 decades, referencing it and adding to its margins in her own hand, building on what he had started. She had also kept the starter. The starter was older than the notebook. It was older than her father, who had received it from his own father, who had received it from the Scottish baker, who had made the crossing with it in his coat. It lived in a small clay pot, with a fitted lid fed with flour and water, on a schedule that Clara maintained with the regularity of breathing a living culture of wild yeast and beneficial bacteria. that had been kept alive and active through 4 generations of a single family. When Clara mixed dough, she took a portion of the starter and combined it with fresh flour and water and let time and fermentation do what time and fermentation do. And the bread that resulted was connected by an unbroken living chain to every loaf that had been made in her family. Going back to a kitchen in Scotland that none of them would ever see, Doyle had not known what the clay pot was. He had not asked. He had stood in the kitchen on that 3rd day after the burial and looked around at the contents of a home he had decided was now his to dispose of, and his eye had passed over the clay pot without registering it as anything of particular significance. His eye had not passed over the notebook. He had picked it up from the shelf and opened it and looked at the pages with the expression of a man encountering something in a language he does not speak and has no interest in learning. He had turned several pages. He had looked at the diagrams of oven construction, at the columns of temperature measurements, at the notes on fermentation cycles that Clara's father had written in his careful hand. He had said that he had always known Edmund's wife kept strange things in this house. He said it to the air of the kitchen, not to Clara specifically, as if she were not present in the room, as if the comment were a general observation rather than a judgment directed at a person. Clara had said nothing. Doyle had walked to the fireplace with the notebook. What happened in the next 3 seconds was a thing that Clara's mind would return to for months afterward, not in the way that the mind returns to pleasant memories, but in the way it returns to the moments it cannot fully process, the moments that are too large and too sudden for the available time. She had understood what he was going to do before he did it. She had understood it and had crossed the kitchen in the 3 seconds available and had gotten her hand on the notebook just as it cleared the edge of the mantelpiece and was moving toward the fire. She had not gotten the notebook. She had gotten 1 page. A single leaf torn away in the moment when the notebook left her grip and fell into the flames, holding 1 page in her burned fingers while the rest of it went in a particular way. That paper goes in a fire quickly and completely, as if it had never been there at all. Doyle had looked at the page in her hand, and then at the fireplace, and then at her face. He had said that she could take what she could carry. She had taken the page. She had taken the clay pot. She had taken the clothes on her back and the shoes on her feet. She had taken Bess, who came without being asked, who appeared at her heel when she went to the door, as if the dog had understood the situation in a way that did not require explanation. She had walked out of the house she had lived in since she was 20 years old on a night in October 1889, when the wind off the mountains had the particular edge that precedes the first serious weather of the season. She had walked toward the mountains because the mountains were what was in front of her, and because there was no other direction that meant anything. At that moment, no road that led to a place where she had standing no door she could knock on and expect to be received as something other than a problem to be managed. The path she followed was no path at all. It was the way the ground allowed her to go through the lower timber at the edge of the Whitmore property, and then up into the older forest on the lower slope of Sable Ridge, where the trees were the big second-growth hardwoods that had come up after the first cutting, and were now 100 years into their own patient accumulation of bulk and height. She moved through them in the dark with the practical navigation of a woman who had lived her whole life in mountain country and knew how to read slope and drainage and the direction of the wind through the canopy. The storm came in an hour after she left the house. It came in the way of Appalachian autumn storms without a long announcement, gathering over the ridge in the dark and then descending with a completeness that left no ambiguity about its intentions. The rain was cold and heavy, driven horizontally by a wind that found every gap in her clothing, with the methodical thoroughness of something that was not trying to hurt her but simply did not care whether it did. The trail she had been following, such as it was, became a shallow creek in 20 minutes. The clay pot was heavy in her arm. The page was in her coat tucked against her chest, under the button the only thing she had thought to protect from the wet. She moved higher because higher was away. Away from the house. Away from the road that Doyle's decisions had made a road she had no right to walk on anymore. Away from the town that had watched the Whitmore family bury Edmund and had watched Doyle arrive with his papers 3 days later and had found nothing in either event that required their comment or their intervention. She moved higher, and the weather moved with her, and the forest grew older and darker, and the footing became the footing of steep mountain terrain, loose stone and root, and the particular treachery of wet leaves over hard rock. She fell on a stretch of exposed granite about 2 hours into the climb. The fall was not dramatic. She simply stopped being upright. One moment she was moving, and the next she was on the stone with her palms down and her left knee taking the impact, and the clay pot cradled against her body. In the instinct of a woman who understood what it contained better than she understood most things. The pot did not break. Her palms were bleeding. Bess was at her side before she had fully registered that she was down the dog's warm flank pressing against her arm. She lay on the wet stone for a moment and let the rain come down on her. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about the morning he had pressed the notebook into her hands and what he had said about everything he knew being in there. And she was thinking about the single page that was against her chest right now, which was all that remained of everything he knew. She was thinking about 42 years of bread made from the instructions in those pages, bread that she had pulled from the oven and set on the kitchen table for Edmund, and for the neighbors who came by, and for the families in the valley who had received loaves from her in the years when their own circumstances were thin. She was thinking about the starter in the clay pot that she was holding against her body in the rain on the side of a mountain which had been alive longer than anyone she had ever known, and which was the last living connection between herself and the women who had kept it alive before her. She pushed herself upright. The granite face of the ridge rose directly above her, a wall of rock that the rain ran down in sheets, and where the wall met the slope there was a dense curtain of old ivy, the kind that takes decades to establish on a rock face, thick and dark and hanging from the stone, like something draped there deliberately. She grabbed the ivy to stabilize herself on the slope and pulled herself to standing, and the ivy gave slightly under her weight, in the way that a curtain gives when you put your hand against it from one side, and behind the movement she felt the absence that the movement revealed. Not more rock, not more mountain, air. She pulled the ivy aside with both hands, and the lamp-black dark of the gap opened in front of her. The cave entrance was perhaps 5 feet wide and 4 feet high at its widest point, irregular in the way of natural openings rather than made ones. The stone around it, worn smooth in places by what appeared to be water, rather than the passage of people. She could not see inside, but she could feel what was inside. And what she could feel was different from the cold, wet air that was currently attempting to remove all warmth from her body. The air coming from inside the cave was cold, but it was dry cold, still. Cold, the cold of enclosed rock, rather than the cold of moving weather. And there was something else in it. Something directional. A current that was moving not inward but outward, the cave breathing toward her. She ducked her head and went inside. The passage was narrow for perhaps 10 feet, and then it opened into a chamber that she could not see the full extent of in the dark, but that she could feel around her the way you feel a large room in the dark. by the change in the acoustics of her breathing and the absence of close surfaces. Bess came in behind her. The dog shook water from her coat in the darkness and then was still. Clara stood in the blackness with the rain beating on the ridge above her and thought about fire and light. She had matches in her coat pocket, a tin of them that she had put there that morning with no particular plan, but with the habit of a mountain woman who did not leave the house without them. She found the tin by feel and opened it carefully, protecting it from the wet. She struck one against the stone of the cave wall and held it up. The chamber was perhaps 15 feet across at its widest and perhaps 12 feet high. The walls were the dark iron gray of the ridge's underlying geology, dry and clean, except for a few mineral traces running down from the ceiling. The floor was uneven, but there were sections of it that were flat enough to use. In one wall, a natural alcove in the rock shaped roughly like the kind of niche you might cut deliberately into a wall to hold a lamp. And above her, in the ceiling of the high point of the chamber, a narrow, irregular passage that ran upward through the rock at an angle that she could not see the end of, and from which, even as she held the match up and watched the flame, she could see the flame bending very slightly, bending toward her, bent by the draft that was moving down through the passage from whatever was above, from wherever the passage emerged on the surface of the mountain. The match burned down to her fingers. She let it go and stood in the dark again. She reached inside her coat and found the page. She had not looked at it since she grabbed it from Doyle's hand in the kitchen. She had known what was on it in a general way, known it was one of her father's pages, but she had not had time or light to see which one. She held the page in the dark for a moment, still wet from the rain, not yet willing to use another match. She had spent 40 years reading that notebook. She had read it the way you read something you love, repeatedly and slowly, and with attention to the small things, the marginal notes, the corrections, the places where her father had crossed something out and written a better version above it. She had read it often enough that large portions of it were resident in her memory, not as recalled information, but as known things, things that lived in her. The way the motion of kneading lives in the hands of someone who has done it for 40 years below the level of conscious retrieval. She struck a second match. The page was one she knew immediately, not by the text alone, but by the diagram in the upper right corner. A diagram she had looked at many times without ever having specific cause to use it. It was her father's illustration of what he called the ideal conditions for a retained heat oven in a mountain environment. He had drawn it after a winter in which 2 of his neighbors had lost their homes to chimney fires, and he had spent that winter thinking about what the ideal oven would require to be safe and efficient in a cold climate. The diagram showed an oven built into a wall of stone, which he believed was superior to a freestanding structure for heat retention. It showed the dome dimensions he had calculated for optimal heat distribution. It showed the precise angle of the flue in relation to the dome, an angle he had determined through years of observation to draw heat effectively, without allowing the fire to burn too hot or too fast. And at the top of the diagram, in the small, careful lettering he used for notes, he considered essential. He had written about the ventilation. He had written that the ideal situation, the situation that combined safety with efficiency and allowed a baker to work without the perpetual risk of smoke accumulation, was a natural draft. A cave or underground chamber connected to the surface by a natural passage that would carry smoke upward and outward while simultaneously drawing fresh air downward to feed the fire. He had written that such formations existed in the karst and ridge country of the Appalachians, and that a baker, fortunate enough to find one, would have what he called a gift from the mountain itself. Clara held the match up and looked at the diagram and felt the draft from the passage above her, moving the flame in her hand. She did not move for a long time. The match burned down. She did not need another one. She knew where she was. The morning came slowly to the interior of the cave, arriving not as direct light, which the angle of the entrance prevented, but as a general brightening that moved through the ivy curtain and found the walls, and turned the iron gray of them to something warmer. Clara had slept without intending to, sitting with her back against the wall, and Bess pressed against her side, and she woke to the sound of water dripping from the rock outside, and the smell of wet forest, and something else under it, something mineral and particular. The specific smell of the cave itself, which she was beginning to understand as a smell she would know for some time. She was stiff from the stone and the cold and the fall, and she moved carefully as she stood, taking inventory of what hurt and what worked and what would be reliable. Her knee was swollen from the impact on the granite, but it bore her weight without giving way, which was the essential question. Her palms had dried overnight and the scrapes had closed. Her hands were functional. This was the most important thing. She took the clay pot from her pack and opened the lid and looked inside. The starter was there. It was cold from the night, and it was dormant in the way that starters go dormant in the cold, not dead, but slowed to a near imperceptible metabolic pace, waiting for the conditions that would wake it. She had kept starters through cold before, and knew that cold was not the danger. The danger was neglect, the breaking of the feeding cycle, the withholding of what the culture needed to continue. She replaced the lid carefully and held the pot for a moment, feeling the particular weight of it, which was the weight of the clay and the culture inside, but also in some way that was not physical. The weight of everything the pot represented. She took the page from her coat and spread it on her knee and looked at the diagram in the morning light. On the obverse side of the page, she had not seen this yet. There was writing. It was her father's hand, smaller than his usual script. The writing of someone using the back of an already used piece of paper. For a note that needed to be made compressed and efficient. She read it in the light that came through the ivy. He had written about beginning from nothing. He had written about a time before she was born, before her parents had come to the mountains, when he had been separated from his own starter by a circumstance he did not detail, and had been forced to create a new culture from the wild organisms in the air. He had written that this was entirely possible and that the air of the mountain hollows in Appalachia was particularly rich in the wild yeasts that would colonize a flour and water mixture if given the right conditions. He had written out the method, precisely the flour-to-water ratio, the temperature range that encouraged colonization, the schedule of feedings that would select for the organisms you wanted over the course of 10 days to 2 weeks. He had written that the culture that resulted would taste different from the one you had lost, because it would be drawn from a different place, from the particular air of wherever you were, rather than the air of wherever you had been. And he had written that this was not a flaw, but a feature that bread made with a local starter told the truth about the place that made it. Clara read the page twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back against her chest. She was 62 years old. She had one clay pot of dormant starter, one tallow candle stub she found in her coat pocket, a tin of matches, 3 days of dried food, the page her father had written on both sides, and a cave in the West Virginia mountains with a natural draft running from its interior to the ridge above. She stood up and looked at the alcove in the cave wall. She measured it with her eyes, the way her father had taught her to measure spaces in terms of thermal mass and surface area, and the relationship between volume and heat retention. She looked at the draft passage in the ceiling and tried to estimate its angle and cross-section based on the behavior of the air moving through it. Then she went outside. The morning was cold and clear after the storm, the way Appalachian mornings are clear after the big autumn rains have washed the air clean. The ridge rose above her in the pale light, and the valley lay below in the low mist that collected in the hollows after rain. She could see from where she stood the roof of the Whitmore house through the trees, a thin line of smoke coming from the chimney. She looked at it for the length of time it took her to understand that she was done looking at it. Then she turned back to the cave. The creek in the ravine below was running high from the night's rain, which meant it would be carrying the clay deposits from the bank she had noticed on her way up the rich gray clay that would make good mortar if she could get enough of it. The forest floor around her was thick with loose stone from the exposed geology of the ridge-flat pieces of the iron-gray schist that she could select for shape and size and use for the oven floor and walls. The wood on the forest floor was wet now, but would dry in the cave in the conditions the draft created. And above the tree line there would be standing dead wood that the rain had not soaked through, dry fuel that she could reach if she climbed. She had built bread for 42 years. She had built it from the knowledge her father had put in her hands and in his notebook, and in the two-sided page that was against her chest right now. She had built it in a kitchen with a proper iron stove and measured flour, and the particular pride of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and why it worked. Now she would build the oven first. She went back into the cave and sat down on the floor next to Bess, who raised her gray muzzle and then let it fall again with the economy of an old dog who has learned that not every moment requires a response. Clara put her hand on the dog's flank, the same place the familiar warm rise and fall of the breath. She took the page out again. She looked at the diagram. She looked at the dimensions her father had noted, the angles, the calculations for the flue. She looked at the note on the obverse side about building a culture from the wild air of the mountain hollow. She looked at both sides of the one page that remained of everything her father had known. Then she put it back and began to think about clay. The clay was in the ravine exactly where she had thought it would be. She found it on the third morning when the creek had dropped enough after the storm to allow her to work the bank without the current pulling at her feet. It was gray-blue clay, dense and cold from the water table that fed the seam, and it had the particular plasticity of mountain clay, the kind that holds its shape when you press it and yields cleanly to the thumb without crumbling. She dug it with her hands and a flat piece of shale she had shaped against a harder rock until its edge was functional if not elegant, and she loaded it into the canvas sack she had fashioned from her outer coat, which she no longer needed for warmth, because the labor of digging generated more heat than the October air could remove. She made 4 trips down to the ravine and 4 trips back up to the cave that first day of gathering, and by the time the light through the ivy curtain had gone, the deep amber of late afternoon, she had a pile of clay in the corner of the cave that was larger than she would need for the first oven, and not nearly as large as she would need for everything she was planning. She had been planning constantly. Planning was not a luxury. It was the thing that kept the other thoughts from having the space they wanted. The thoughts about the house, the thoughts about Edmund, which were the worst because they were not angry thoughts, only sorrowful ones. The thoughts of a woman who had loved a man for 42 years and was now conducting her life in his complete absence and had not yet found the right way to carry that. She planned instead. She measured the alcove in the cave wall with spans of her hand and committed the dimensions to memory. She studied the draft passage above and watched how different conditions outside wind and temperature and the pressure differential between the surface and the cave interior affected the flow of air through it. She studied her father's diagram on the page until she understood not just what it prescribed, but why the reasoning beneath the prescription. The physical principles her father had been encoding in his measurements. The oven would be built into the alcove. This was settled. The alcove was roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep and 5 feet high. At the back, wall dimensions that her father's diagram indicated were compatible with a retained heat oven of sufficient size to bake 4 to 6 loaves per firing, which was more than she needed for herself, and considerably more than she had for the first several weeks, while the supplies she had brought with her lasted, and the cave's resources became known to her. The foundation stones came from the scree field above the tree line. She climbed for them on the second day before the clay gathering, selecting pieces of the iron-gray schist for their flatness and density, looking for the particular combination of surface area and thickness that her father had described as ideal for an oven floor. Stones that would absorb heat from the fire and hold it long after the fire was out, releasing it slowly into the bread through the bottom of the loaves. She carried them down in loads that were determined by what her body could manage over the distance and the terrain, which was less than she would have managed 20 years ago, and more than she would have expected from herself in the circumstances. This was something she noted without sentiment. The body's capacity was what it was. The work required what it required. The only question was whether the capacity was sufficient for the requirement, and the answer to that question was determined by doing rather than by calculating. The first oven took 11 days. She built the foundation from the flat schist, fitting the stones together with the closeness of a good floor. Filling the gaps with a sand and clay mortar she mixed to the consistency her father had described, thick enough to hold its shape when pressed between the stones, but loose enough to fill the irregular gaps completely without air pockets. She let the foundation set for a full day before she built on it, working in the mortar the way her father's notes described, pressing it into the seams and drawing the excess away and returning to each seam twice to ensure the bond was what it needed to be. The walls of the dome came next. She gathered additional stone from the ridge above the cave, smaller pieces this time selected for their curve friendliness for the way they would lie against each other in the ascending arc of the dome, without requiring so much mortar that the structure became mortar rather than stone. She had no form to build the dome against, no curved support to hold the stones in their arc while the mortar set, which meant she had to work in sections, building a portion of the curve and letting it cure before adding the next, trusting the clay mortar to set hard enough in the cold of the cave to hold what was above it while she added more. She worked by the light of the oil lamp and the candle, and by the thin light that came through the ivy curtain during the middle of the day. Bess slept and watched and slept again. Occasionally, the dog would get up and go to the cave entrance and stand there for a while looking out through the ivy, not with any apparent purpose, but with the watchfulness of an animal that considers monitoring the approaches to be part of its function. And then she would come back and lie down in the position she had settled on as hers, close to the spot where Clara worked, close enough to touch if touching was wanted. The flue was the part that required the most attention. The natural draft passage in the ceiling of the cave was not positioned directly above the alcove. It was off-center about 3 feet to the right and perhaps 2 feet back from the wall. Her father's diagram did not address this specific situation because the diagram was theoretical and the cave was specific. But the principle it encoded was clear enough. The flue of the oven needed to connect to the draft passage, and the connection needed to be made at the right angle and with the right cross-section, or the draft would not draw, and the smoke would stay in the cave rather than leaving it. She solved this by building the flue not vertically, but at the angle required to reach the natural passage, calculating the angle by measurement and adjusting it as she built. Checking the draft with a few strands of dried grass held at the opening at each stage of construction to see which way the air moved and how strongly. She spent 2 full days on the flue alone, and she rebuilt one section of it when the grass test showed her the connection was partially blocked by a stone that was sitting in the airflow. When she finally lit a small test fire in the completed oven, a handful of dry wood and some dry leaves, and held the grass strands at the flue opening, and watched them pull inward and upward with a clean, steady draw. She felt something in her chest that was not triumph exactly, but was its quieter and more durable cousin. The oven was not finished. The outer clay coat was only 1 layer thick and needed 2 more, each layer applied after the previous had dried to achieve the thermal mass her father's calculations required. She applied those layers over the next 4 days, using the clay from the ravine mixed to a stiffer consistency for the outer coats, which needed to be harder and more weather-resistant, even though they would never see weather, because they needed to resist the thermal expansion and contraction of repeated use without cracking through to the stone beneath. On the 15th day in the cave, she built the first real fire in the completed oven. She built it with hardwood that she had been drying in the cave for 2 weeks, stacking it near the draft passage where the moving air accelerated its drying, and the wood burned with the clean, complete combustion of properly dried fuel. Almost no smoke. The kind of fire that a retained heat oven needed to drive its temperature to the level where the stored heat in the walls and floor would continue to work after the fire was drawn out. She watched the oven with the attention she would have given a patient checking the way the heat was distributing through the stone by placing her hand near, but not on the outer clay surface, and feeling where the warmth was even and where it was not. She fed the fire for 2 hours. She drew the coals and sealed the opening with the flat stone she had prepared for exactly this purpose, fitted to the opening with enough precision that almost no heat escaped through the seal. She let the oven rest for 30 minutes, which was what her father had prescribed the period in which the heat distributed itself evenly through the thermal mass without the fire's direct influence. Then she had nothing to put in it. This was the reality of the first 15 days. She had been so focused on the construction that the matter of what to bake had been present in her thinking only as a future problem, a problem that would become relevant when the oven was ready and that she would address then. Now the oven was ready and the problem was present. She had flour, a small supply of it, mixed grain flour from the provisions she had packed on that first night. Not enough for sustained baking, but enough for a beginning. She had the starter. She had been feeding the starter since the 2nd day in the cave, maintaining the schedule without deviation, using small amounts of the flour she had brought, and water from the creek in the ravine. The starter had responded. Cold had slowed it, but not stopped it. And as the cave warmed slightly from the work and the candle and the body heat of a woman and a dog occupying it, the starter had begun to show the signs of an active culture. The slow blistering of the surface, the gradual rise and fall of the mixture in the pot, the smell that shifted from the neutral smell of flour and water to the complex, slightly acidic smell of fermentation in progress. She mixed a small batch of dough from her provisions flour, and a portion of the starter and a pinch of the salt she had brought, and she let it ferment for the long time, 12 hours, moving through the fold and rest cycle that her father had described. and that 42 years of practice had made automatic in her hands, the gesture requiring no thought, only the presence of the hands and the dough and the time. She slid the loaf into the oven on a flat stone she used as a peel. She sealed the opening. She waited. When she broke the seal after the time her father had prescribed, the smell that came out of the oven was a thing she had not expected to be as powerful as it was. She had baked bread hundreds of times, thousands of times, and the smell of bread coming from an oven was as familiar to her as the smell of the forest or the smell of Edmund's coat. But something about the enclosure, about the concentrated nature of the smell in a small cave after weeks of cold and effort and stone and the particular loneliness of a life suddenly and completely remade, made the smell different in a way that she could not have described accurately to anyone who had not been there. The loaf was not perfect. The crust was darker than she would have chosen if she had been in control of every variable, and the crumb was denser than a longer fermentation and a wetter dough would have produced. But it was bread. It was bread made in an oven she had built from a diagram her father had drawn in a cave on a mountain in West Virginia by a 62-year-old woman who had been told to take what she could carry. She broke the loaf in half and gave a piece to Bess, who ate it with the focused appreciation of an animal that does not complicate gratitude, and she ate the other half herself, standing in the cave with the warmth of the oven still radiating against her back. The flour problem needed a solution. She had brought enough for perhaps 3 more bakings at the scale she had been working, and after that she would need another source. The valley below had a mill, a small water-powered operation on the creek that served the farms of the hollow, and the mill would have flour. But the mill meant the town, and the town meant the people who had watched Doyle arrive with his papers and had found nothing worth saying about it. And Clara was not ready for the town. Not in the way that a woman who has just been dispossessed is ready to return to the people who witnessed the dispossession without objection. She needed a way to acquire what she needed without becoming visible. Hester Vane was the answer to this problem, before Clara had fully formulated the problem, because Hester had been the answer to certain kinds of problems in the mountains around Sable Ridge for 30 years. Clara had known Hester in the way that everyone in the valley knew Hester, which was by reputation, an occasional sighting rather than by any sustained acquaintance. Hester was perhaps 75 years old, a figure of the high country who had lived for decades in a cabin above the timberline that no one had ever been definitively invited to visit. She came down to trade several times a year, always on her own schedule and always briefly appearing at the edge of the settlement with bundles of dried herbs and rolled furs, in a manner that did not suggest she was interested in conversation, and seemed to get what she needed from the transaction and leave before anyone had fully decided whether to try for one. She was known to have survived things that would have killed other people and to have a knowledge of the mountain's resources that no one else in the area could match. She was not someone people approached. She was someone people were approached by on her terms and in her time. Clara had not been thinking about Hester when the smell of the bread went up through the draft passage and out the opening on the ridge above the cave. Hester had been thinking about Hester, which is to say she had been going about the business of her morning, which, on this particular day, involved the harvesting of the late-season herbs that grew on the south-facing slope above Clara's cave, dried by the autumn sun to the concentration that made them most potent when the smell reached her. It moved up through the cold air from the opening in the ridge in a way that the wind moving across the slope from west to east distributed over a wide area, and Hester was downwind of it and received the full benefit of the distribution. She stopped walking. She stood on the slope with her collecting bag in her hand and she breathed in the smell of bread from a sourdough oven. And she did not move for a period of time that she would not have been able to estimate afterward. It was the smell of her mother's kitchen. That was the first thing it was before she had processed what it meant in terms of the present situation, before she had begun to reason about the source. It was the smell of the kitchen she had grown up in a farmhouse in the valley below, that no longer existed, that had been taken down for its lumber 30 years ago, and was now a field corner indistinguishable from any other. Her mother had been a baker of the old kind, a woman who kept a sourdough culture and baked by feel, and by the particular knowledge that comes only from years of attention to a single craft. The smell coming from the ridge was the smell of that kind of bread. Not the flat, yeasted bread of convenience, but the complex, living culture bread of a tradition that was becoming rare in the valley, and that Hester had not encountered in years. She sat down on a stone and breathed it in. Then she began to walk toward it. She found the ivy curtain without great difficulty, because the smell was a guide, and because she knew the ridge and its formations well enough to know where a cave of the relevant size was likely to be found, and to move toward the possibilities with a logic that the smell confirmed. She pushed the curtain aside and looked in. What she saw was this: an old woman kneeling beside a dog near a stone oven that had been built into a cave wall with the precision of a person who knew exactly what she was doing. And on the shelf above the oven, a small loaf of bread. The cave was warm in the way of a space with a functioning oven, rather than just a fire warm in the even persistent way that stored heat produces, and it smelled of clay and bread, and the particular mineral quality of the mountain itself. Clara looked up. The two women looked at each other for a moment without speaking. Hester's face was a record of outdoor decades, deeply lined in the way of people who have spent their lives in sun and wind and cold, and her eyes were a clear, pale blue that seemed inconsistent with the weathered face around them. Too bright and too direct for a woman who had chosen to live apart from people. She looked at Clara the way a person looks at something they are categorizing rather than judging with attention, rather than assessment. The way you look at a plant you want to identify rather than evaluate. Clara's hands were in her lap. She was covered in clay to the wrist from the morning's work on the outer coat of the oven, and her face was smudged with the wood ash of the test fires. And she sat in a cave she had been in for 3 weeks with a dog and a sourdough starter and a page from her father's notebook. And she looked back at Hester Vane with the directness of a woman who had stopped having anything to hide at approximately the moment Doyle threw the notebook in the fire. Hester looked at the oven. She looked at the shelf with the small loaf on it. She looked at the clay pot near the entrance that held the starter. Her gaze was specific in a way that suggested she understood what she was looking at. She said that bread smelled the same whether it came from a kitchen or a mountain, and that it had carried a good long way. Clara said that the draft passage in the ceiling went to the ridge above. She said it without apology, as a fact about the cave's construction that was relevant to the conversation. Hester looked up at the passage in the ceiling and nodded in the manner of someone confirming a deduction. Then she unslung her collecting bag from her shoulder and set it on the cave floor and reached into it. She brought out a block of salt wrapped in cloth. She set it on the floor. She brought out a paper-wrapped package that, from its weight and shape, was clearly a quantity of milled flour. She set that beside the salt. She looked at the loaf on the shelf. "Trade," she said. Clara looked at the salt and the flour. She looked at Hester. She said she would need to know how much flour for how much bread, and what else the woman might want, and whether she could be trusted not to say where the bread was coming from to anyone in the valley. Hester said she had been keeping her own counsel for 30 years and saw no reason to change the practice. They worked out the terms. It was not a long negotiation. Both women understood value, and neither of them was interested in the kind of conversation that surrounds negotiations among people who have the luxury of time. Hester would bring flour salt and whatever other goods Clara specified that Hester had access to. Clara would bake and provide loaves in a quantity proportional to the supply. The bread would go where Hester determined it should go, and the source of the bread would not be named. Hester left that afternoon and returned 4 days later with a sack of flour that was considerably more than Clara had expected the good pale flour of the Valley Mill, and a quantity of dried beans and a length of wicking and more lamp oil. And she took 6 loaves back down the mountain in her collecting bag without further ceremony. The arrangement changed everything in the way that the right resource changes everything, which is that it removes the constraint that has been determining the shape of every other decision and allows the actual work to proceed at its natural scale. Clara had been limited by flour. She was no longer limited by flour. She scaled her bakings accordingly, mixing larger batches and using the oven at its full capacity rather than at the fraction that her small supply had previously imposed. But the flour was not the only resource that changed in the weeks after Hester's first visit. Clara's body changed, not in the way of improvement exactly, but in the way of adaptation. The way a body adapts to the specific demands being placed on it over time. The climbing and the carrying and the clay work and the kneading had done what sustained physical work does to a 62-year-old woman's body. When that woman has spent the previous 42 years working hard, but within the limits of a domestic schedule, rather than the limits of mountain labor. There were aches in the first weeks that receded into a background awareness, and there were muscles that developed the kind of functional density that comes from being asked to do difficult things repeatedly until the difficulty becomes ordinary. She understood this as information rather than as a complaint. The baking settled into its rhythm. She fed the starter each morning, noting its condition, adjusting the temperature by moving the pot closer to or further from the oven in its cooling phase to keep the culture within the range that produced the flavor she wanted. She mixed dough in the mornings after the first, feeding the long pre-ferment that developed flavor through time rather than through anything she had to do other than leave it alone. She folded and rested through the day. She fired the oven in the evenings, building the fire to temperature, and then drawing it and sealing the opening and loading the loaves on the stones. She had learned were exactly the right temperature by the time she slid the loaves in. She pulled the finished loaves in the mornings and set them on the slate shelf to cool. Every evening she took the page from her coat and read it in the lamplight, not because the information had changed, because it was the last thing her father had written, and it was the only piece of it she had, and reading it was a way of being with him in the only way still available. It was on the obverse side of the page in the small, dense handwriting he used for notes. Rather than prescriptions, that she found the thing that stopped her in the 7th week. She had read the note about wild yeast capture multiple times. She knew its contents. But on this particular evening, with the oven cooling behind her, and Bess stretched out in her usual position, and the smell of the day's baking still present in the cave, she read it again, and this time she arrived at the final line which she had registered before, but not in the way she registered it now. Her father had written that a culture begun from the wild air of a specific place would carry the character of that place in its flavor, would tell the truth about the mountain that made it, and would produce bread that was unlike bread made anywhere else. Bread that was specifically and exclusively of its origin. He had written that this was the real nature of a sourdough culture, not merely a leavening agent, but a record of place. a living archive of the organisms that floated in the air of a particular location at a particular time, and that the bread made from it was therefore a form of memory specific and irreplaceable, and belonging to no other place in the world. She sat with this for a long time. The starter she had been feeding in the cave was not her mother's starter anymore. It had been, when she left the house, the direct continuation of the culture her grandmother had kept, which had been the continuation of her great-grandmother's, which had been brought from Scotland in a clay pot by a man who believed the Appalachians would reward patience. But the starter she was now feeding had been diluted week by week with fresh flour and the water from the cave's creek, and the wild organisms from the cave's particular air had been joining it through the feeding process, colonizing the edges of the culture and the original organisms while not gone, had been diluted and supplemented, and the community of life in the pot was increasingly the community of this specific cave, on this specific ridge, rather than the community of a kitchen in the valley or a crossing from Scotland. This was not a loss her father had written. It was a transformation. She thought about this while the oven cooled. She thought about the 4 generations of women who had kept the culture alive, each one in a different kitchen, in a different year, each one feeding it with the particular flour available to her and the particular water of wherever she was, each one influencing its character while maintaining its continuity. And she thought about herself as the 5th doing the same thing in a cave, and whether what she was making was a continuation or a beginning. She decided it was both. It had always been both. In the 9th week, Hester told her about the ones who were receiving the bread. She told her in the way she told everything, without preamble or sentiment, with the economy of a woman who had learned to communicate precisely because she rarely communicated at all. She described the families at the edges of the settlement, the ones who were not invited to the gatherings at the church hall, and the ones whose situations were too reduced to sustain the kind of social exchange that the settled families maintained. She described the prospectors who lived in temporary structures up the smaller creeks, men who had been there for years without becoming part of anything. She described what the bread meant to them, which she did not describe in emotional terms, but in observational ones, in the terms of what she had seen, which was that they received it and they ate it. And after the eating, there was something in their manner that had not been there before. Clara listened. She thought about 42 years of bread carried to the neighbors when circumstances warranted. She thought about her mother, who had never in Clara's memory turned a person away from the kitchen, who had fed people with a matter-of-factness that communicated that the feeding was simply the appropriate response to a person's presence, and hunger that it required no discussion or context or justification. She thought about what the page said, the line she had been carrying against her chest since October bread is not made to be kept. It is made to be given. She told Hester to bring more flour next time. She would build a second shelf. She would fire the oven twice a day through the winter. She would have more bread than one woman could carry up a mountain, which meant Hester would need help. And they would work out what that meant in the terms available to them. Then the weather changed. It did not change in the gradual way of the normal turning of Appalachian seasons. It changed in the way that winters change when they have decided to mean something, when the systems moving down from the north have gathered enough over the Great Lakes to arrive at the mountains with a determination that the mountains do not moderate but amplify. The temperature dropped through the floor of what the valley had prepared for. The snow came and came more and stayed longer. And in the 3rd week of December, the pass road, which was the valley's connection to the county, and the county's stores and the suppliers in the wider world, closed under a depth of snow that no one in the settlement had seen accumulate in that time of year, in the memory of the oldest person available. The valley was closed. Clara was in the cave when Hester came up in the first real blizzard, with the news the old woman moving through the storm, with the steady pace of someone who has been moving through Appalachian weather for most of her life, and has made the practical accommodations that make it possible. She was covered in snow, and she was matter-of-fact about the state of the valley and what it meant, which was that the stores the families had laid in for a normal winter were not stores designed for this, and that the families at the edges, the ones whose stores had never been generous, were already in a state that would not wait for spring. Clara stood at the oven. The oven was hot. It had been fired that morning. The loaves from that firing were on the shelf, cooling a dozen of them, dark, crusted, and dense, and fragrant with the complex sourness of the cave's culture. On the upper shelf, another dozen. The bins she had constructed along the back wall of the cave held flour and dried beans, and the other stores that Hester's trading had built up over the previous 2 months. The cave was warm, and it smelled of bread and the fire, and Bess and the mineral cold of the mountain, all of it together. The specific smell of a life being lived in a specific place. She looked at the shelves. She looked at Hester. She looked at the page, which was not in her hand, but which she knew without looking, which she had read enough times that it was in her the way knowledge is in a person, when it has moved past the stage of learning into the stage of being knowledge, that no longer needed to be retrieved because it was no longer separate from the person who held it. She said there was work to do. She said Hester should rest for an hour and eat something, and then they would begin. She said they would fire the oven again tonight and again tomorrow morning, and they would keep firing it for as long as the flour lasted, and the wood held out, and their hands continued to function, which she intended to be a very long time. Hester sat down. Bess moved to the old woman's feet in the way the dog moved to anyone who sat down in the cave, as if sitting were an invitation to comfort that she was obligated to accept on behalf of whoever needed it. Clara turned back to the work. They worked through the night, not continuously, because continuous work was not efficient, and efficiency was what the situation required. They worked in shifts of 3 hours, one woman sleeping while the other tended the fire and managed the dough at its various stages of development. And Bess moved between them without preference, lying against whichever body was at rest, providing the specific heat of an old dog who understands that warmth is something that can be given without being diminished. Clara had organized the work before they began, in the same way she organized all work, by thinking through the sequence of constraints and identifying which ones governed the others. The oven could fire twice in a cycle of approximately 14 hours. 2 hours to bring it to temperature, 1 hour of fire, 30 minutes to stabilize baking time, cooling time before the next fire. That was fixed. The dough required its fermentation time, which could not be hurried without losing the quality that made the bread worth eating, and that she was not willing to compromise because the bread was going to people who had nothing else, and what they received needed to be the best thing she could make. That was fixed. The flour and the starter needed to be managed in proportion to each other across the full production cycle, which meant she needed to plan 2 days ahead at all times, always preparing what the next fire would need before the current fire was finished. She laid all of this out in her mind on the evening of Hester's arrival and made the adjustments, and then began because there was nothing else to do except begin. The loaves accumulated on the shelves. By the morning of the second day, there were more loaves in the cave than Clara had ever produced. In any equivalent period of time, the slate shelves full, and the stone ledges along the lower walls serving as additional surface, and the cave smelled so intensely of bread and the wood smoke of the oven that it had become the dominant quality of the air, the thing you registered before any other sense had time to report. Hester ate without comment and slept without difficulty, and worked her shifts with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman whose relationship with physical labor had long since moved past the stage of effort into the stage of simply doing. She was not a baker. She had not been a baker in any practiced sense since the kitchen she had grown up in, and her handling of the dough was not skilled in the way Clara's was skilled. But she was strong, and she was attentive, and she followed instruction without the friction of someone who believes they already know a better way. And this made her a useful partner in the parts of the work that were not about technique, but about sustained physical presence. On the second night, when the valley below was deep in the kind of cold that follows a blizzard and settles in and refuses to leave, they loaded the carrying sacks. Hester had brought 2 large canvas sacks in addition to her usual collecting bag, and they filled all 3 with the cold loaves from the shelf, packing them with the efficiency of people who understand that the carrying capacity is a constraint, like the oven capacity and the flour supply, a number that does not argue with itself. They wrapped themselves in every layer available and went out through the ivy curtain into the night. The mountain under full winter was a different entity from the mountain in any other season. Not merely colder, though it was colder in the bone-through way of high country winter, but different in its fundamental character, stripped of the sound and the movement that the other seasons provided, and left with only the sound of the wind and the squeak of boots on packed snow, and the irregular breath of 2 old women descending a steep slope in the dark, with as much bread as they could carry. The sky was clear above the ridge, the stars extraordinarily bright and numerous in the washed cold air, and Clara looked up at them once, and then kept her eyes on the ground because the ground was what required attention. They moved through the timber at the lower slope and came down to the edge of the settlement from the east, from the side that faced the back walls of the properties, rather than the main road, and they went door to door in the dark, without knocking, setting loaves on window sills and doorsteps, and the bench outside the cold church, and they were finished and moving back up the mountain before the first light touched the eastern ridge. They did this for 5 nights. On the 5th night, coming down the eastern slope, Clara heard a sound behind her and turned. It was nothing a branch dropping its snow in the dark. But the turning and the sound together put a thought in her mind that she had not allowed herself to think clearly before, the thought about how long this could continue and what it would become when it could not continue anymore. She was 62 years old, and she was climbing a mountain in winter and descending it at night in the dark. And she was making bread in quantities that required her sustained physical attention. And she was doing this from a store of flour that was finite. These were the constraints. The question was not whether the constraints would eventually determine an outcome, but when. She did not discuss this thought. She carried it back up the mountain with the empty sacks and set it in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be kept rather than resolved, and she went back inside and built the morning fire. On the 8th day of the sustained baking operation, Hester did not come back from the valley. She had gone down in the afternoon with a load of bread and had said she would return before dark, and dark came without her. Clara was not immediately concerned because Hester was a woman who had navigated the mountain in all conditions for 30 years and who was not in the habit of being stopped by weather. But the dark deepened and the temperature dropped further, and Clara began to tend the stove with a portion of her attention, while another portion listened for footsteps on the slope outside. Bess stood at the cave entrance at one point in the late evening. The dog's posture changed from its usual looseness into the specific alertness of an animal that has registered something outside the established range of the ordinary. And then she relaxed and came back in. And 10 minutes later, Hester ducked through the ivy curtain covered in new snow, with a look on her face that was different from her usual look. She said the valley had figured out the bread was coming from somewhere. She said a group of men had stayed up the previous 2 nights watching the edges of the settlement, and that on the second night they had seen her, and another figure moving from the timber with heavy loads. She said they had not approached, had watched and waited, and that this morning there had been a meeting at the church hall, and the decision had been made to follow the next delivery back to its source. Clara considered this. She said they would come anyway then. It was not a question. Hester said they would. She said there were children in the settlement who had been surviving on the bread for a week, and the men who were going to follow the trail were not going to be stopped by preference. She said this in the way she said everything as a condition of the situation, rather than a recommendation about what to do about it. Clara looked at the shelves. She looked at the oven, which was in its cooling phase from the afternoon's firing, the clay walls still warm to the hand. She looked at Bess, who was in her position near the stove, watching Clara's face with the amber attention that had been watching her face for 11 years. She looked at the page from her father's notebook, which she had taken out that morning to check a detail of the flue maintenance, and had left on the flat stone near the oven, rather than returning it to her coat. She picked up the page and looked at it. Bread is not made to be kept. It is made to be given. She had been giving it in the dark, invisibly, to people she could not see receiving it. The giving had been complete in that form. She had not needed to be present, for it had not needed to watch it happen, or be seen as the source of it, or receive anything in return for it. And this had suited her because being unseen was the condition she had organized her life around since October, since the night she walked out of the house and into the rain. But the bread had found them anyway. It had found them through the smell that went up the draft passage and out the ridge and down to Hester on the slope. And now it had found them through the simple physics of a trail in the snow and the willingness of hungry people to follow a trail to its end. She folded the page and put it in her coat. She told Hester they would fire the oven one more time tonight and load the shelf as full as it would hold, and then they would let the morning come. The morning came cold and clear and very still. The stillness of a mountain winter morning when the wind has stopped and the snow has stopped, and the world has paused in the particular way it pauses when a system has moved through, and the next one has not yet arrived. Clara was at the oven when she heard the sound of boots on packed snow coming up the eastern slope. More than one person moving with the care of people on uncertain terrain in cold. She did not go to the cave entrance. She was at the oven when they came. She had a loaf on the stone peel ready to go into the oven for its second firing of the morning, and she was holding the peel in both hands and watching the oven the way you watch an oven that you know reading its temperature through the slight shimmer of the air above the floor stones. She heard the ivy curtain move behind her, and she heard the small sounds that people make when they encounter something they were not fully prepared for. The arrested breath, the involuntary stop of forward motion, the complete silence that is different from quiet, because quiet is the absence of sound. And what filled the cave in that moment was the specific silence of people who have stopped making sound, because they have encountered something that requires all of their attention to comprehend. She slid the loaf into the oven. She did not turn around immediately. She settled the peel, adjusted the position of the loaf, sealed the oven, and then she turned. There were 7 of them. Men, mostly 2 or 3 women in the back. People she recognized as faces from the valley. Faces she had seen at the market and the mill and the church steps across 42 years of living in the settlement that lay below. They were looking at the shelves, at the rows of cooling loaves at the oven, with its warm clay walls, at the organized space of a working bakery in the interior of a mountain. They were looking at all of it, and they were looking at her. And she looked back at them with the steadiness of a woman who has spent 2 months living alone on a mountain and has passed through whatever fear of being seen was left in her on the far side of the solitude. A man she recognized as George Abel, who ran the feed store in the settlement, said her name. He said it the way you say a name when you are confirming that the person in front of you is who you think they are, not as a greeting but as a verification. She said that the bread on the shelf was for the valley. She said she would put together what they could carry today, and that she would have more ready in 2 days, and that they should send someone up then. The man said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the oven. He asked how long she had been here. She said, since October. The cave was quiet in the way of a space where several people are thinking about the same thing at the same time, which was the arithmetic of what she had said, October to December, and what that duration represented in terms of the work visible around them, the fitted stone shelves and the clay oven, and the organized stores and the loaves on every surface. A woman near the back of the group, a woman Clara recognized as someone she had spoken with at the church social 3 years ago. A woman whose youngest child had been sick that fall and whom Clara had brought a loaf to without being asked, began to cry without making a sound about it. Just tears running down her face in the cold air of the cave, with her expression unchanged, the weeping of a person who is too tired and too cold and too hungry to manage it privately. Clara looked at her. She did not move toward her. She was not a woman who moved toward weeping. As an immediate response, not because she lacked feeling, but because she knew that what the woman needed was not comfort from the source of the food, but the food itself, and the food was the thing she could provide. She loaded a sack from the shelf and handed it across to the nearest person. She told them to distribute it the way they had been distributing it to the families with children first, and then to the older households. She told them to come back in 2 days, and the sacks would be ready at the cave entrance, so they would not need to come inside. George Abel said that he wanted to understand what she needed. He said the settlement would provide it if it was in their ability to provide it. He said this with the plain sincerity of a man who has been humbled by circumstances and is not trying to negotiate his way out of the humility. She told him flour. She said she had enough for another week at the rate she was baking, and that after that the rate would need to decrease unless the supply increased. She said she would write down the quantities and the type of flour, and he could take the list with him. She wrote the list on the back of the envelope that had held the salt Hester had brought in November, with a piece of charcoal from the oven, and she handed it to George Abel, and he folded it and put it in his coat pocket with the gravity of a man receiving an important document. They loaded the sacks they had brought. Clara added to the loads from the shelves until the sacks were full, and there was still more on the shelves, and she told them that everything on the shelves was theirs, and that she would have more ready. They left. Clara stood in the cave after they had gone and listened to the sound of their boots on the slope receding until there was only the cave sounds. Again the draft in the passage above, and the small creaking of the cooling oven, and Bess's breath from near the stove. She stood there for a while in the way she stood in the moments after significant things happened, not processing exactly, not reviewing what had been said and what it meant, but simply being in the place where the thing had happened and letting the air of it settle. Then She turned and began to prepare the next batch of dough. 2 days later, 3 men came up with flour and a quantity of other supplies. Cornmeal and dried beans and a jar of preserved pork fat, and 2 bottles of lamp oil, more than she had requested, delivered without ceremony and received the same way. They took the sacks she had ready and went back down. The pattern established itself without formal agreement. Every 2 days, the men came up and brought supplies and took bread back down. The quantities increased as the settlement found the means to sustain the operation. Contributions coming from the households that had stores to spare the organization, happening at the settlement level, without Clara's involvement or knowledge. She learned about the organization later, much later, from George Abel, who told her that the meeting at the church hall after the discovery of the cave had been the most attended meeting in the settlement's history, and that the contributions had been given without argument, which he said was not something that could typically be said about any collective undertaking in the valley. The winter did not relent. January brought temperatures that froze the water in the creek to the bottom in the shallow sections and turned the deep sections to glass that held for weeks. February brought 2 more storms that added to what was already on the ground until the snow on the flat sections of the slope was taller than Clara. She baked through all of it, maintaining the rhythm that the situation required, firing the oven and folding the dough and pulling the loaves and setting them on the shelves. And the loaves went down the mountain every 2 days in the sacks that came up full and went back down full. She was not thinking about Doyle during this period. This was worth noting because she had thought about him extensively in October and November, not with the consuming bitterness of a woman who had been given over to a single grievance, but with the persistent low-level attention of a person working through the implications of a significant event, turning it over and examining it from different angles in the idle hours. But December and the sustained baking had left no idle hours, and January and February left less. And the thinking that occupied her working mind was the practical thinking of production and supply and the management of the cave's resources. And Doyle had been displaced from that thinking by the requirements of things that mattered more in the immediate term. He came in March. She was not surprised. She had known, in the way you know things that follow logically from other things, that if the settlement knew where she was, then Doyle knew, because the settlement had never kept a secret from anyone living in it for long. And Doyle had been in the settlement his whole life, and was in the habit of knowing what there was to know. She had known he would come, and she had thought on the handful of occasions when the thought presented itself about what she would say when he did. And she had arrived at the conclusion that she would not need to say much because the cave would say it for her. He came on a morning in early March, when the light was beginning to have in it the first quality of coming spring, still cold, still fully winter in any practical sense, but different by some small increment from the deep winter light that had preceded it. He came alone. She could hear the single set of footsteps on the slope long before the ivy curtain moved. She was at the oven. She was loading the morning's loaves onto the peel, the second firing of the day, the 4th batch of the week. The dough had been excellent that morning. The culture active and expressive, the fermentation having proceeded at exactly the rate she had intended. And the shaped loaves on the slate shelf had held the surface tension of well-developed dough all through the proofing, springing back from a gentle press with the elasticity that meant they were ready. She heard the ivy curtain. She did not turn. She slid the first loaf into the oven and adjusted its position, and slid the second in beside it, and adjusted, and then the third. She set the peel down and sealed the oven. She picked up the wooden-handled brush she used to sweep flour from the work surface between bakings, and she swept the surface, slowly working from one end to the other. With the same attention she gave every task in this place, the same attention she had been giving it for 4 months. Then she turned. Doyle Whitmore was standing inside the cave entrance. He had not come far in. He was standing at the point where the passage opened into the main chamber, which meant he had a full view of the chamber, and everything in it, the shelves and the oven, and the stored supplies and the organized work surfaces, and the page on the flat stone. She watched him take it in. He looked at the shelves first. There were loaves on 3 shelves and cooling loaves on 2 stone ledges along the lower wall. The production of the previous 2 days, waiting for the next group to come up. He looked at the oven, the fitted stone dome with its clay outer coat, the draft passage above it, the flat stone seal resting against the cave wall. He looked at the work surface and the tools arranged on the stone shelf above it, the peel and the bench scraper, and the bowl she used for mixing the particular organization of a workspace that has been used every day for months by a person who knows where everything is and why it is there. And then his eyes stopped. They stopped at the flat stone near the oven where Clara had left the page that morning, taking it out to check the flue maintenance notes as she sometimes did, and then setting it down when the oven needed her attention. The page was lying on the stone with the diagram side up her father's careful drawing of the oven dome, and the flue angle, and the draft passage, the notes in the small, precise handwriting, the dimensions and the calculations that she had built from, and that had made everything around her possible. She watched him look at it. She had been wrong or not entirely right in her estimate of what would happen when he saw it. She had thought he would look at it and understand the way you understand a fact that has been demonstrated rather than argued, and that the understanding would sit somewhere on the spectrum between uncomfortable and humbling, but would be a settled thing, a conclusion, something arrived at and acknowledged. What happened was different. He looked at the page for a long time. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have seen before and are seeing differently now. Not because the thing has changed, but because the context has changed around it. The way a word looks different when you read it in a different sentence. He knew what the page was. He had held it before he threw the notebook in the fire. Had held it for the 3 seconds between picking up the notebook from the shelf and crossing to the fireplace with it. And in those 3 seconds he had looked at this page, and what he had seen was what he had always seen when he looked at the notebook, which was his sister-in-law's strange attachment to her dead father's strange preoccupations. The notebooks and the charts and the measurements of a man who had spent his life treating bread as if it were science. He was looking at the oven that the page had made. He was looking at the shelves of bread that the oven had made. He was looking at the evidence of the winter that the bread had sustained not as abstract information, but as the specific physical reality of a cave in a mountain where a 62-year-old woman had done what she had done with nothing but the single page he had not managed to put in the fire. Clara watched his face. She was not watching for what she wanted to see there, which would have been a particular kind of reckoning that she had imagined in the difficult nights of October and November. She was watching the way she watched the oven for information, rather than for vindication, because vindication was a thing she had found she did not need in the way she had thought she might need it, had found she had lost the appetite for in the months of sustained work, and the accumulation of a life that had outgrown the injury that preceded it. His face moved through things she could not name exactly, things that were in the category of understanding, but that were more specific than understanding in the general sense, more specific and more costly. The kind of understanding that requires the abandonment of a position held for a long time by someone who has not previously been in the habit of abandoning positions. He did not speak for a long time. Bess was at Clara's feet looking up at the man in the entrance with the clear-eyed assessment. of a dog that takes the full measure of people it has not encountered recently. She did not growl. She did not move toward him. She simply looked. Doyle's gaze came from the page to Clara. He said her name. He said it in the way people say names when the name is all that is available, when the sentence that should follow the name has not yet formed, when the name is being used to hold the space open while the rest catches up. She waited. He said he had been wrong. He said it with the particular difficulty of someone saying a thing they have not previously said and do not have the practiced ease that saying it would eventually produce. He said he had been wrong about the notebooks. He said the word wrong with the weight of someone who has been deciding for a long time whether to put weight on it, and has finally made the decision. The cave was quiet in the way it was always quiet, with the underlying breath of the draft, and the small ticking of the cooling oven, and the long still of the mountain around them. Clara reached to the shelf behind her and took down a loaf. It was a loaf from the previous evening's firing, fully cooled, the crust gone from the shattering crackle of fresh to the settled firmness of a loaf a day old. She broke it along the natural fault line of the ear, the scoring cut she made on every loaf, before it went into the oven and the crumb revealed itself in the cold air of the cave, open and irregular, threaded with the air pockets that the long fermentation produced, still faintly warm at the center. The way a well-baked loaf stays warm at the center long after the surface is cooled. She held out half. He took it. He did not say anything more. He stood in the entrance of the cave with half a loaf of bread in his hand, and he looked at it. And she turned back to the oven because the oven was at the stage that required her attention, and the bread did not wait for anything. The spring came in the way Appalachian springs came slowly, and then suddenly the snow retreating up the slope week by week until the lower mountain was mud and new grass, and the cave entrance was surrounded by the pale green of the first growth, pushing through the leaf litter. The ivy curtain that had been Clara's door since October had grown with the warming weather and thickened around the entrance, and she let it grow because it was a door she had come to like, one that moved when the wind moved and admitted the changing smell of the season and required no hardware. The men who had been coming up for bread every 2 days brought news with them as the weather improved, news about the pass road opening and the first wagon coming through from the county, news about the families who had made it through, news about the decisions the settlement had been discussing through the winter, about its own preparedness for winters to come. George Abel told her on a mild morning in late March that the settlement had decided to build a communal oven, a large one on the common ground near the church hall, and that they wanted to know if she would help them build it. She said she would. She said she would need good clay from a creek source and flat, dense stone for the floor, and a site with natural draft, if one could be found, and that, if they could not find a site with natural draft, they would build the chimney to the specifications her father had drawn, and she would show them the specifications. George Abel said that was fine, and that they were grateful. She said gratitude was not what she was interested in. She said she was interested in the settlement knowing how to do this for itself, so that it did not need her for it, and that the point of her showing them was to make herself unnecessary, and that this was what she intended. He said that was an unusual way to think about it. She said her father had thought about it that way. She said he had believed that knowledge was not worth much if it sat in one place, that its value came from moving, from being passed to the hands that would put it to work. He thought about this. Then he said he would bring the men up the following week to look at the cave oven, before they chose a site so they could see what they were aiming for. She said to come in the morning before the first firing so they could see it cold, before they saw it working, in the second week of April, when the snow on the upper slope was still there, but retreating and the lower mountain was fully into its spring transformation, Clara came down to the valley. She came down with Bess in the middle of the morning, following the path she had made in October. And that 5 months of use had worn into something that was unmistakably a path. Now a deliberate line from the ivy curtain on the ridge to the edge of the settlement below. She carried nothing. She had left the cave as it always was. The oven banked low, the dough in its first ferment, the shelf with its loaves for the next delivery. The settlement in spring was different from the settlement she had left in October, not in its structures but in the quality of its movement. The particular way that communities move when they have come through something together, and know it when the thing they have come through has changed the way they occupy the space they share. She saw this in the way people moved on the main road, and the way they looked at each other, as they passed the slight difference in a look that has been altered by shared extremity. She walked through the settlement toward the common ground near the church hall where George Abel had said the oven site would be. People looked at her as she passed. She looked back. There were nods, some of them. The brief nods of people who know each other well enough that more is not needed. And some of them the slower nods of people who are trying to communicate something that the nod is not quite adequate to, but that they have not yet found the words for. A woman she did not know well came out of a doorway and said her name and thanked her. And she said the woman was welcome and kept walking. Bess walked at her heel. At the common ground, George Abel was waiting with 3 other men and a set of rough stakes he had been using to mark out the site. He showed her what he had in mind, the location, the dimensions, the relationship to the road and the church hall, and the prevailing wind. She walked the site and looked at the ground and the surrounding structures and the direction of the wind. And she said the location was good, but the chimney height would need to be higher than he had marked to clear the roof of the hall, and he adjusted the stake. She spent most of the morning at the site answering questions and making suggestions and demonstrating with her hands in the air the proportions that the oven required. And the men listened and took notes in the way of men who were determined to understand and not merely to comply. Late in the morning, Doyle Whitmore came across the common ground. She saw him coming, and she continued what she was saying to George Abel about the clay mortar mix, until she had finished the point because the point was not finished. And then she waited. He came to the edge of the group and stopped. He had in his hands a cloth-wrapped bundle that he held with the careful attention of someone carrying something they are not sure of, something whose reception is uncertain. He held it out. She took the bundle and unwrapped the cloth. It was a notebook. Not her father's notebook, which was gone, which no cloth wrapping could restore. It was a new notebook, the same size and binding as her father's, the pages blank. She looked at it in her hands. She looked at the blank first page. She understood what he was asking. He was asking her to fill it. He was asking her to put in it what she knew what her father had known, what the cave in the winter and the 4 months of sustained work had added to what her father had known, the full inheritance of a family's knowledge of bread and fire and the particular chemistry of fermentation in the mountain air of West Virginia, written down in a form that would last beyond her. She held the notebook and thought about the blank pages. She thought about her father pressing the original notebook into her hands on the morning she left for the Whitmore house, the weight of it, the particular gravity of a thing, given with the understanding that it contained everything worth knowing. She thought about the 42 years she had added to its margins in her own hand, building on what he had started. She thought about the fire and the page and what she had built from the page, and about the culture in the clay pot on the cave shelf, which was not her mother's culture anymore, but was something continuous with it and distinct from it at once, which was the nature of living things passed from one keeper to the next. She thought about what her father had written about knowledge and where its value resided. She looked at the blank first page of the notebook. She said she would need good ink. She said she had things to write down that were not in any existing record and that needed to be in one. Doyle said he would bring ink. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, which was the weight of the blank pages and the binding and nothing more, yet nothing but the potential of what it could hold. Then she looked up at George Abel and the other men waiting at the oven site with their steaks and their questions, and she tucked the notebook under her arm and went back to the work of teaching them what they needed to know. That evening, coming back up the mountain in the long spring light that stayed in the sky above the ridge, long after the valley had gone to shadow, Clara stopped at the place on the path where you could see both things at once. The valley below, with its smoke from the supper fires and the scattered lights beginning to show in the windows, and the ridge above, with the cave entrance invisible in the darkening stone, and the first stars appearing in the pale sky above the timberline. She stood there for a while with Bess sitting at her feet. The valley below was not the valley she had walked away from in October. It was the same collection of structures and the same road and the same mill on the creek. But the winter had been a fire of its own kind, and what was left after the fire was different in its essential composition from what had gone in. She had not planned this. She had not set out in October with any intention beyond surviving, had not conceived of herself as a person who was going to change anything. Had only been a woman with a clay pot and a page in a cave that the mountain had provided. The bread had done the rest. She thought about her father's hands guiding hers in the dough when she was small, the warm pressure of them, the way he would say, "Not yet," and hold her hands still when she wanted to rush the fold. The way the patience he was teaching was not patience as an abstract virtue, but patience as a technical requirement. The understanding that the dough needed what it needed when it needed it, and not before, and that the baker's job was to provide the conditions and then wait. She thought about 42 years of providing the conditions and waiting. She thought about the page against her chest, which was where she still kept it, even though she knew it by heart. Now knew both sides of it, in the way she knew the inside of the cave in the dark, by something deeper than memory. Bess stood up and looked at her. Clara looked down at the dog. Bess looked back with the old amber eyes, patient and direct, waiting for the next thing, ready for whatever came after the standing still. Clara put her hand on the dog's head, the warmth of it, the familiar shape of the skull under her palm, the small movement of the dog leaning into the touch. She turned and continued up the mountain. The cave was warm when she ducked through the ivy curtain, warm in the deep, even way of a space that has been heated by sustained use over months, until the walls themselves have come to hold a temperature that the air alone cannot account for, the warmth of stone that has been fired and allowed to cool and fired again so many times that the firing has become part of its character. The dough in the bowl had risen to the correct height in her absence. The starter in the clay pot was active, the surface blistered with the small bubbles of a culture, doing what it had always done, what it had been doing in one form or another, since a man she had never met stepped off a boat in a country he had never seen and put his hand in his coat to check that the pot was still there. She lit the lamp. She took the blank notebook from under her arm and set it on the work surface. She found the piece of charcoal she used for marking the loaves before scoring, and she sat down in the chair she had made from a flat stone and 2 pieces of hardwood, and she opened the notebook to the first page. She She thought about where to begin. She began at the beginning. She wrote about the wild yeast in the mountain air and the way it found a flour and water mixture and colonized it over the first 10 days, what to look for, and what it meant when you saw it. She wrote about the way the culture changed over the weeks of feeding the shifts in smell and texture that told you how it was doing and what it needed. She wrote about the cave air, specifically the particular organisms in the air of this hollow on Sable Ridge, what they produced in the bread, and how the flavor that was not like any other bread made anywhere else in the world, because the air here was not like the air anywhere else in the world. She wrote for a long time. Outside, the spring night moved across the ridge, and the valley below held its lights and its fires, and the settlement that had come through the winter went about the quiet business of its evening. And in the cave in the mountain, a woman wrote down what she knew, so that it would not be lost again. Bess slept. The lamp burned. The starter breathed in its pot, and the bread that would go down the mountain in the morning sat on the slate shelf in the warm dark of the cave, cooling toward morning, ready to be given to